Welcome to Business Talk here on businesstech.co.za, where we explore the ideas shaping South Africa's economic and institutional future. And unless you've been living under a rock, you'll know that 2025 marks a defining moment for South Africa and for the African continent as we assume the G20 presidency for the first time. And the main event is just around the corner. And beyond the symbolism, this really is a chance to reset how Africa engages with the world's major economies, to move from the margins to the center, and from being a recipient of solutions to really becoming a co-architect of them. And few voices are better placed to reflect on this than my guest today, Professor Francis Petersen, who's the Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Pretoria, as well as the Chairperson of University South Africa, a chemical engineer by training and a leader by temperament. Professor Petersen has spent his career bridging the gap between industry and research and society. And today we're going to be exploring how higher education can really help translate South Africa's G20 presidency theme, fostering solidarity, equality and sustainable development, into real-world impact. So, Professor Petersen, I must say it's a great pleasure to have you on Business Talk. It's been described as a pivotal moment, South Africa's G20 presidency. But for academia, what does this milestone represent for you personally?
Thank you, Michael, and it's great having me. It's for academia, it is critically important because in academia we educate the next generation of graduates. So we want to make sure that those are graduates that understand the dynamics globally, not only in South Africa or on the continent, but also globally, and for the academics to understand how one would update, align curricula at institutions to global trends, and therefore we would then be important to ensure that we deliver graduates that can interact globally. Something like the G20, engaging in different aspects of the G20 is therefore crucial from that aspect alone. But then universities are also very well known for their research output and development and innovations. And those are aspects that make contributions to the country and to the continent and also globally. So it also gives the universities an opportunity to showcase some of those research results, some of those research output, some of those innovations to the world out there. And then thirdly, no country ever operates in isolation. And so academia, we need to engage with our counterparts as academic institutions, but also those recipients of the academic output, also globally. So it gives us an opportunity also to learn from others. And therefore, for me personally, from an academic perspective, from an institution perspective like the University of Pretoria, from a higher education sector perspective for all our 26 public universities in South Africa, is an opportunity to be able to do all of those three.
And at such an important moment, if you just look at what's going on in the US, the world's largest economy, and an attack on the academic sector over there, I think really important to come together and to show that we stand for academic freedom and certainly resist those temptations to those autocratic tendencies almost to stifle academic freedom and thought. Now, if we just to zoom out, and I mean, the G20 has historically been dominated by the world's largest economies. How significant is it for Africa, and specifically for South Africa, to lead this conversation in 2025?
I think it's critically important, Michael. And as you have indicated in your introductory remark, it's the first time that the G20 presidency is being allocated on the continent. So it's an opportunity for us, against the background of what play out in geopolitics, where there is, for me, confusion, challenges also in the developed countries, and therefore it's to a certain extent an opportunity to reset those type of geopolitical relationships, to reset how, if you look at the economy, how economies interact, engage with one another, developing economies, developed economies, underdeveloped economies. It's an opportunity to reopen dialogue again. I think the geopolitics have challenged the notion of nationalism, of protectionism. It's all about me and not about the rest of the world. And I think the opportune time for us in a developing country context to bring that narrative to the fore, it is immensely crucial. So I think spot on in terms of the timing. But as you know, Michael, the important thing is you can have the platform to provide the narrative and maybe a few suggestions how to unlock the narratives. But it's really about how do you take it forward to action. And that for me is some of the critical things that need to be unpacked. And I think for South Africa, to a certain extent, it's also an opportunity for us to not talk on behalf of the continent or not to talk on behalf of developing countries and developing economies, but also to make sure that their voice is effectively heard and heard clearly.
Yeah, inclusive dialogue. And that really, if you look at South Africa's history, our democratic history is one area where we can hold our heads up high. So hopefully we build on the presidency's theme, which rather ironically is fostering solidarity, equality, and sustainable development. Given what we've just discussed, it really speaks to directly, I think, to the aspirations of the global South. How do you see this theme influencing the tone and the substance of discussions among G20 nations?
I think to a certain extent there's an openness. I believe there's probably one a key country that make it a little bit difficult to reach consensus in some, I would say, some of the discussions at the committee level. But generally, it's an opportunity for other G20 countries, and also you must remember, at these 2020 gatherings, you also have associates that comes with. It's not only the G20 countries, uh, um, associates that are from the developed world. So I think there's an openness for that, due to the fact that, if you just take one example, the geopolitics has it clearly impacted supply chains, for instance, and how people look at supply chains. So there is that interconnectedness. There is also trying to look to see if we do approach and look at sustainable development, and we talk about green energy, then a lot of those elements that will form part of that green energy envelope are critical minerals that sit on on the continent. So how do you engage with that in a professional level? It's also, South Africa. I've got a lot of understanding, a lot of knowledge, in terms of how do you deal with difficult challenges and talk through that in a sort of Ubuntu format, the solidarity format. And I do think that some of those elements are important where even developed countries experience that sort of challenges within their own countries, even if they are developed. So I think there are elements that developed countries have that still mimic developing countries' challenges, and how do you have that conversation? And the whole issue of saying that, uh, uh, um, clearly what the wars has indicated, what the action of one or two countries have done is to also show the interconnectedness of the globe. So therefore, we can't really get away from that. So how do we interconnect then, that shows that we are much more just, much more fairer, much more equitable, and I think there's a urge. Certainly, what I've picked up in some of the smaller events that led up or leading up towards the big event in November, uh, that developed countries are open. So they believe, and I think they're correct, that there's also a lot of learning that not only goes to one side, but also to the other side in a developed world context.
Yeah, and I think because of the moment we're living in, that ability to leapfrog and to learn from each other and not just be passive recipients of IP that's developed in the developed world, in the developing world, is important. And back to your point that universities are at the center of that. They're the engines of knowledge and innovation and social transformation. And we know very often it's that IP that then from a university goes into the private sector and makes big impact. In tangible terms, how do you see South African universities contributing to solve some of these big global challenges that we've got? We see a big rise in inequality. It's probably fanning a lot of the geopolitical trends that we're seeing of populist leaders. We've got climate change, food insecurity. And are we doing enough to align our research priorities with these global imperatives in our universities?
I think, Michael, we can obviously do much more. Let me start there. But I do think that universities, South African universities, universities on the continent, and also globally, but let's focusing on South Africa and on the continent, that they align their research much more closer to the grand challenges, the global challenges of the world, the challenges that either linked to the Sustainable Development Goals or linked to Agenda 2063 of the African Union. And it speaks to some of the things that you just mentioned. It speaks to inequality. It speaks to the whole issue of sustainable development, where we look at energy, climate change, all of those. But it also talk about peace, justice, having a fairer world, being a healthier world. So if you look at most of the university's key priorities and strategic goals, they are aligned with that. But that's the one part. The second part is how do you convert that into something more tangible? Because that was your question. And I think it plays out in different ways. It plays out at a policy level. So we do have our different faculties like law, political sciences, and humanities that do provide policy output that guide policy development and specific policies for governments, not only in South Africa, but also globally. And we've seen that. The question is whether there's a take up, obviously, from the governments to that, but they're doing that. They're doing specific research on if we're looking at how do you create efficiencies in supply chain, how do you make sure that processes become more competitive. We're looking at engineering, the built environment, natural sciences. There's a lot of good research that talk about cleaning of water, for instance, specifically in communities where we don't have clean water. We're looking at how do you provide, even in a clean water environment, a good distribution of water to the different areas or recipients. That's work that we're doing. We're looking at how do you make the mining industry much more competitive so that we can ensure that we can recover good quality, efficient processes of critical minerals, for instance. So there's a whole suite of process dynamics that we do. And then we actually also engage with our local communities, because universities, there's a realization more and more so that universities, although they are universal, global in knowledge, they still very much their place in which they are situated and the context in which they are situated are immensely important. So how do you engage with your local communities and the issues that they have, which are probably sometimes an effect of global issues, of global challenges, but it is experienced at the global level. So all of that universities are engaged with. And I think that question that you asked, Michael, what are universities doing tangibly uh, uh, um, to respond to the global challenges is also becoming key because the public is asking the question more and more, Why should we send our students or our children to universities? What is the value that universities bring to the individual, to the communities, to the country? And for me, the larger question is the question of eligibility, specifically against the background of the challenges of the challenge of the democratic mission of universities, that a particular country, not only one country, there's a couple of countries that is driving that sort of narrative aggressively. And therefore we need to show, I think there's an imperative for us to show, what are you doing tangibly to respond to global, but also much more micro challenges and micro issues.
Yeah, it's a daunting challenge as well, given the financial constraints that universities are operating under. Ever since the HERE Commission's recommendations were ignored and free education was made policy, and I know universities are now grappling with how do you do this? How do you deliver on all of this while still maintaining your financial stability? And I would imagine partnerships are the way to go. You really, and you emphasize, as universities, you don't work in isolation. You're working within the context of your communities and where you're situated. So what are the models, just briefly, that you've seen that have really worked when you want to build partnerships as academia, with government, with business, with civil society? What are those models that you believe can deliver that kind of inclusive, sustainable outcome that the G20 envisions through partnership?
Michael, that's a very loaded question, but I think the important, I would always start off that because partnerships, and specifically the partnership that we're looking for as universities, means that we have to engage with sectors that are outside of academia. And therefore, you need to understand their language and they need to understand your language. So if that isn't clear, then I can tell you the partnership is going to be superficial. So it's important, even if your goals are more or less the same, the language in which you translate those goals might be different. So the way that we approach it, surely at the University of Pretoria, but I know that other universities are also doing that, is to bring the university, the outside partners into the university. We have got advisory boards that bring in members of government, industry, private sector, commerce, even non-governmental organizations to come and hear what we are doing from a curriculum perspective, but also to listen. And I often say to my academics, you have to hear and you have to listen. Those are two different things. Because sometimes an academic, you believe that everything that you do and what you say is the one version of the truth, and therefore you don't allow that moment of pause where you listen to say, well, goodness, that's a wonderful idea that this government official actually is putting on the table. So that's the first tier. How do you make sure that there's a ease of engagement with amongst the different sectors? It's not talking about partnerships as yet. And then we can say, well, now that you understand our business and we understand where you're coming from, we can say, okay, but maybe the partnership could start with bursary support. The partnership could start with, let's support a research project. And then it becomes, it moves from knowing to understand each other's language to a sort of a collaboration. And where we would like to go, and I think that is what I also emphasize in the different meetings with the G20, we must start to move to the concept of co-creation. So if you, Michael, you represent an sector and I present academia, let's say, well, this is a particular issue that we have. Let's conceptualize a potential solution together. And what universities need to understand, and the universities that I've been to, I've emphasized that concept constantly, that universities are not the only custodian of knowledge. And once academics start to understand that, the knowledge that Michael will bring in is as important as the knowledge that I would bring in from the university. And then you start to co-create. And that is when we're talking about real partnership. Partnership then it becomes sustainable. We capitalize on the knowledge that outside of academia with academia, and then if we get to a solution, Michael will accept the solution far better than he giving me funding to do a research project and I'm selling him the results afterwards. So that's the model. It's for me a three-tier model, and that's what we at the University of Pretoria is currently. I would use the word aggressively in inverted commas, positively, aggressively driving, and it actually is becoming one of our strategic pillars going forward. Is and because what you then do, you then create then the whole issue of transdisciplinarity, and universities then should make sure that they become accessible, not that elite institution on the hill, but anybody could come and have that feel safe, they feel credible, self confident to be able to engage then with the academic, and that's ultimately the partnership that that I certainly, and I think universities in South Africa but also globally should be striving towards.
That's very refreshing to hear, because I think sometimes fairly, I think oftentimes unfairly, universities have been critiqued for sitting potentially in ivory towers and not listening to those external voices of partners. So the fact that you've made it so central, I think, is hugely important in the context of this conversation of solving for these knotty, thorny, big, hairy, audacious challenges. We talk about BHAGs and goals, but I talk about BHACs because they're big, hairy, audacious challenges. But we need this kind of collaborative thinking and multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, if we're going to solve for these. And if we look at an example, I see the University of Pretoria now hosts Africa's first center for the fourth industrial revolution. And you're doing this in partnership with the World Economic Forum. Maybe you could just share a little bit more about this and how you see this initiative shaping Africa's digital future.
So, Michael, that exactly is an example of what I just explained, because the South African Center is a 4IR center, which is supported and linked to the World Economic Forum, which obviously give a immense broad exposure in contacts with similar centers, but also other issues that the World Economic Forum is engaged with. But the center, in fact, is governed by academics. So so I'm chairing the governing board, but we do have three other vice chancellors on as part of the governing board. We have director generals of four national government departments. We have members from industry, CEOs, and members of the executive. We have obviously the World Economic Forum. And effectively is what we're trying to do is that the center will primarily focus on industry in technology, but also try to see how do we infuse digital technologies much more amongst government and amongst public institutions generally. But it also apply digitalization to industry to make it more competitive and more efficient. And that's the reason why the industry is there. But it also create a platform where universities could play that neutral role of convening. So if we, for instance, in our energy mix, have a large proportion or large focus now on nuclear energy, the question is still whether the public is on board with that, although it's in our industry mix plan. So it will be in the center an opportunity to create a platform, a conversation with the public, non-governmental organization, government, and with other universities, science councils like Mintech and the CSIR to do that. So it's an opportunity for us to be able to say, well, we now got a center that's not only going to promote, we're also going to do research. We're also going to look at the application of that in industry. And we have universities, government, science councils, academia, civic society to a certain extent. That's all part of that. And that for me is exciting, because now you can start to make impact. And one of the things, for instance, is that we do a lot of work on the African continent on AI. Uh, uh, um, but I think the diffusion of those technologies, those tools, the uptake, uh, uh, is not at the level where it should be. And for me, this center should actually help, not only in South Africa, but also largely in the continent, to say, well, how do we take that up? And that's a key challenge within the G20, for instance. It's not that we don't have the capacity to develop these technologies. In fact, we develop language models that is fantastic. But it is, how do we diffuse that? How do we absorb that? And that for me is where the challenge lies. But the center will be, and I said we only launched it. We actually launched it, Michael, when the G20 ministers of science and technology were here. So the Minister of Science and Technology, Minister Blade Monday, organized that opportunity to launch that. And again, for me, that was so opportune to indicate this is what we want to get right and want to give back to the G20 in a sense, because there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of learning that also could come to other areas in the developed world that could come from the center.
I mean, that speaks directly to, certainly from where I sit, I interview lots of business leaders, and recently attended an AGM with a private equity fund, Vuna, and they have a portfolio of companies, many of them in the manufacturing sector, and they're asking themselves, as a private equity fund that prides itself on impact, they don't just go in there and cut jobs. They go into businesses and they improve the employee benefits of the 400 workers at a steel factory, for example, and then improve productivity that way. But they're asking themselves, how is AI in the South African context going to be used in the manufacturing process? We don't want to use it to replace workers. We might want to replace and automate some of the more mundane or risky work, but then we want to shift them to other areas where they can create value elsewhere in the business. So how do we do this? And I mean, it's through centers like this that they can engage collaboratively and help to solve for some of those challenges. Equally, Microsoft Ricardo Rosa said, we're in the age of agentic AI. How many people are talking about agentic AI? We're still playing around with ChatGPT and, the kind of consumer grade AI, whereas he says in Nigeria, they're seeing executives really getting their hands dirty with agentic AI. So great to see the university positioning itself right at the center, I think, of what is got to be one of the most important debates at the moment. I've got to ask you, and it's a bit of a left field question. If you could add one unexpected person to your G20 table, living or historical, who would it be and why?
Michael, I probably would have liked to have seen Steve Jobs at that table, and not only because he exhibits fantastic leadership, but for me the question that I always ask when we have all of these narratives and plans is, how do you convert that to action? And I think he would drive that discussion more to the tangible, the earlier question that you asked. And I think there, for us, I don't want South Africa being the presidency of the G20 to just be another opportunity and a platform to discuss things that we know we need to do. It is how do you leverage the presidency more effectively to ensure that we produce tangible outcomes. So he's for me a very good example. I think he would drive conversations not in a circular mode, but one direction. And I probably would have loved him to be at the table.
I think that would make for a fantastic dinner-side conversation. And I think one of the great ambitions of this presidency to that point is to shift Africa's image from just being this passive beneficiary of aid to a co-creator of solutions. So what are those tangible, practical steps then that the G20 process can take to make that more than rhetoric? So we're not just talking about this and continuing to talk about it a decade into the future.
Yeah. So I would say, for me, Michael, I often ask, are there sort of a legacy type of projects, or larger than projects, programs that could flow out of the G20? And if we look back in 2025, and say, what was the one of the two things that came out? Now, obviously, I'm biased. I think the Center for 4IR is one that I think could become a tangible project, because it's really, how do you digitalize government? How do you digitalize public? And how do you use digital technologies in a way to improve specific advanced manufacturing? That is what the center would be doing, and also to look at energy transition. So for me, that would be something that bring all of the different sectors together. Uh, uh, um, it's something that it is globally connected, because through the World Economic Forum, we are connected with very developed countries, and therefore some of their knowledge and understanding and working together form part of that. But it is locally impactful. So for me, and in fact, the B20, and I was part of the B20, one of the B20 task team as well. The objectives of the center is 150% aligned with the recommendations that the B20 task team, specifically on digitalization, technology, and energy, will present in November. So that would be for me something as a tangible outcome. The other one is probably not in the health cases, in the healthcare field. Uh, um, we do have a fantastic plan, but I don't think we have funding to support that plan. So it might be, for me, a conversation where the G20 could say, well, we're talking about a fairer, a healthier planet, a fairer, healthier Africa, healthier and fairer continent. And there's an opportunity to say, well, to what extent do we looking at financial models, some experience that we had, to make that an example of something that can work. And then thirdly, which for me is obviously also quite important, is the whole issue of supply chains, and how, because there is a focus in countries due to the geopolitical pressure that they want to have supply chains much more closer to the country, not have long supply chains, because you then extend the risk. And to what extent there could be a much more critical conversation with South Africa and the continent, and also with the African Free Trade area, to say, well, let's look at supply chain, because critical minerals is not only in South Africa but on the continent, but there might be others as well, so that we could look at that. So I would say that would be for me three tangible examples that say, well, let's lift that out and make sure that that works. And when we look back in 2025, we can say, goodness, that is what we have achieved. Hopefully, there was a lot of others, but that would be for me the three that I would be focusing on.
No, I like that. I like that you're focused on let's pick a few real impactful, tangible outcomes. And often I think when you have too many, it just becomes something of a wish list or a shopping list. And you don't have that kind of focus that you really need to execute like a Steve Jobs would. And I agree with you. I think we've got such an opportunity, given the moment, given the broader historical geopolitical moment, to relook at those supply chains. Be it in EVs, for example, we produce so many critical minerals for the batteries. Do we have the IP and the know-how? Are we developing the scale? We fund so much of our auto industry. And so there's lots of conversation that we can have there. Just lastly, and we could go on forever, Prof. I've really enjoyed our time. If you look at South Africa's G20 presidency in the rearview mirror, and you'd say, right, that's successful. That was really, it ticks all the boxes. What does success look like? In other words, what legacy do you hope South Africa leaves on the world stage?
So I certainly would say, beside the tangible examples that I already have cited, because those tangible examples will have not only an impact in South Africa, but on the continent, but could also be examples that other developing countries could aspire to. So that, for instance, is one. But secondly, I would like a message to be to come across, and hopefully that's a message that find resonance in the minds of the developed countries, is to say that the world and the developed world can't really go forward at the pace that their own internal domestic strategies and plans require without engaging with the developing world, specifically with the African continent, South Africa and the African continent, for various reasons. The fact that we got this massive youth bulb that means by 2050, most of half of the world's population is going to be coming from Africa, and the youth bulb is quite large. But also the other resources that we have, and therefore, if that narrative could be that what South Africa and what the African continent could offer for the development world in the future, means that the conversation of the G20 discussions from here on, from 2025 forward, will need to be a more equitable discussion, which include Africa. And for me, if we could, in the rear mirror, could look back and say, okay, that is what South Africa also have achieved successfully whilst having the presidency, then I would say, yes, that's what success should look like.
Well, fantastic. We certainly are looking forward to the main meeting, which is just around the corner, as I said, in November. Thank you very much, Professor Francis Petersen, VC and Principal of the University of Pretoria. Really thought-provoking conversation. And I just think that, as you've said, universities are not just places of learning. Yes, they are places of learning, but they're laboratories for the future. They where policy and science and society all meet to shape this more equitable world. So wishing you all the best as you take that conversation into the main G20 meeting and the B20 as well. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.